Patrick, I'm a little late. Went to print out the show notes. There was no paper in the printer. That's the kind of school of hard knocks stuff they can't teach you in college. You have to learn that the hard way.
Yeah, I mean, that's printer 101 right there. But I tell you, the master's course is going to be the ink. That's the tough stuff there.
All right, son, are you ready?
I am ready to go.
Hello, welcome to Hard Compound, an American take on Formula One. We have just finished watching Abu Dhabi, the final race of 2022. And in 3 words, I would say goodbye, farewell, amen. We will say goodbye to a number of legends, a number of great personalities, some hopefuls. But today, the story was one of, what should we say, Patrick? Certainty, clarity. We know who is the best driver, who is the best team. Why don't I get your 3-word take, or no, your any number of word take on Abu Dhabi 2022, Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, this was, like you said, the final race of the season, and we sort of already knew who the best driver was this season and what team was the best, right? We had Max locking up that championship way back in Suzuka, a month and a half ago or whatever. And Red Bull just sort of ran away with the Constructors' Championship. So this race, I think, was really about who finished second. And we got some, what I thought were surprising answers to that. Right. We had Leclerc battling with Perez for that second position in the Drivers' Championship. And then, could we see if Mercedes would storm back to take second place, in the Constructors' Championship? And surprisingly enough, to my surprise at least, Leclerc beats out Perez, and Ferrari ends up, gaining significantly more points than Mercedes did in this race, and holding on to that second position. Really was unexpected.
Yeah, it was unexpected. I thought Sergio would come in second in the Driver Championship. I thought Mercedes, especially after the last few weeks, might eclipse Ferrari to come in second in the Constructors, but perhaps we should not have been so surprised. A theme, I think, of this year has been no one does better under zero pressure than Ferrari. There was no pressure on them this week. So what happens? Charles has a great drive. Carlos has a great drive. The car is fast. The strategy works. So, maybe we shouldn't have been surprised. I think that's a knock on Ferrari that they do their best when there's no pressure, because in F1 and your name is Ferrari, there will always be pressure. So we need to explore that one later. To me, one of the things I was going to talk about was sort of the cruelty of F1. Mick is out. Sebastian, his final race. Ricardo unceremoniously dropped by McLaren. Alonso, another DNF. Hamilton fighting. Could he actually eclipse his teammate George? DNF. But I think actually the theme of this race echoes the theme of this season, which is talent wins out. I just think right now there is no more talented, capable driver than Max, and he ran away with it. The design team started, and from Christian Horner on down, the Red Bull team, I think there's no more focused, talented group in F1 right now than Red Bull. And so despite the new regulations that attempt to equalize the grid, we're really seeing talent rise to the top. And I think that's a sort of a theme to this year's sort of F1 season and this race.
Yeah, definitely. I think ultimately the more talented drivers are going to rise to the top. And we have definitely seen that throughout the season. But it's F1. There's still not parity within the sport, and we saw the top three teams, the three teams that make the most money, can spend the most money, and have the most resources, far and away outpace the rest of the field this season. And I think, we're the sport and the regulating bodies are working on sort of inducing more parity in the sport, and I think that those sort of new rules and regulations that continue to come will help. And we'll see some more battles, and hopefully we will see the sort of that talent rise to the top and really show itself, right? I mean, we had George Russell, right? He finished fourth this season, ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Pretty impressive there. But, he spent so many years at Williams and, was always just driving at the back. That's not much fun, right? I mean,
Right.
Now this season, we finally get to see him in a car, and he just drives great all the time. And that's so much more exciting to see than him sitting at the back. So I'm hoping, right, that in the next few seasons, we get a little bit more of that competition, and that the cars get a little bit closer.
I do think that will happen because I'm a big believer in the new regulations, and I think they've already had an effect. I think right now Red Bull has got everything focused, and they've got such great talent in Max and their engineers, Adrian Newey, Christian Horner, the whole team. But I do think we're seeing equity sort of finally emerging into F1. There was the battle for second, Ferrari and Mercedes. Alpine and McLaren had to battle for the fourth and fifth spot. Haas somehow managed to make it into the eighth spot. And I think when you look back at the Mercedes turbo hybrid era, it was, I think they won 80% or more of the races over years. So I think even though this first year, because Max is so good, because Red Bull was so focused and ready, that they ran away with it, I think we're already starting to see much more competitive racing, which was fun. That said, Max did win easily again this week. And, I actually never did the math because, he didn't let Sergio pass in Brazil. And so that cost him some points, Sergio, in the drivers' championship. But he said he would help him out this race. So I actually don't know, would that have mattered? Charles came in second, but if Max had, did you do the math on that? I have not done the math. Would it have helped him?
Leclerc won by 3 points, and had Verstappen let Perez through last week. Perez would have had 2 more points. So Leclerc would have ultimately still won, but by 1 point instead of 3.
Interesting. I thought that, but I was like, you know what? I'm just going to leave that up to Patrick to math isn't my strong suit. You mentioned George, all those years racing at Williams, he always looked great, but as you said, he finished back of the pack so often. I mean, how about this? His first year at Mercedes, the only win for Mercedes this year, which is shocking in itself. More points than Lewis Hamilton. I think that, I don't want to take anything away from Max, but that might be the story of the year in F1 2022.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really impressive overall season for Russell. I think Hamilton had a really, really rough start to the season. and Russell jumped out to a big lead over him. I think the second half of the season, Hamilton has kind of found his footing and really started driving well. But I think it is it's significant that Russell essentially beat his teammate this season, which I don't know how many times that has ever happened to Hamilton.
Yeah, I think maybe Jenson Button did one year, I think. So, I mean, it's actually pretty shocking. Not that I want to sort of start any bar fights, because this statement certainly would, at least over in England. But when you look at what George did his first year with the team, the only Mercedes win and more points than Lewis. When you look at what Lando Norris did at McLaren, which the McLaren team, I think this year we have to chalk that up as a failure. They didn't even beat Alpine, which was just not good, as Alonso was happy to tell you. Lando kept McLaren in the fight for fourth. He dominated Daniel Ricciardo. I think we can make the case that Lewis Hamilton may only be the third best British driver on the current F1 grid. Now, I'm not going to state that, but I think you could make the case.
I think that certainly you could make the case, but I think you could make the case that any one of those three are the best current British F1 driver. Right. I mean, all three of them are mega talented. For so long, Hamilton was, frankly, the best driver on the grid and in the best car. And, so obviously he won a whole bunch of championships, and the other two are young guys that don't currently have any. But, I think you look at them and you say, under the right circumstances, with the right team, with the right car, they absolutely could be champions. I don't necessarily think you can say that about at least half of the grid. Just a wealth of talent in the UK sort of driver scene. And, we have three guys that can compete at the highest level, and I think they're all doing it really well. I'm with you. I hope that McLaren kind of comes back next season and really puts some good work in and has a competitive car, because, seeing Lando always in no man's land is kind of disappointing, right? I mean, he's so good that he's way ahead of anybody else in the mid pack, but he just doesn't have the car to get up close to the front runners. So he's always just sitting there and between fifth and eighth, kind of not really anywhere in particular.
Right. He's not really impacting the race. He's not really competing for the podium, which is a shame. It's like you said, like all those years watching George at Williams. We're talking about Lewis Hamilton a lot, but this is not his final race. It was for Sebastian Vettel. And, it's pretty shocking. It may have been Sky Sports that noted this, but since 2006, Sebastian Vettel or Lewis Hamilton has finished in the top two. That is a shocking rate of dominance there. Neither did this year, but that is just, I think, amazing when you think about it. It also means Mercedes and Red Bull have sort of dominated the last 15 years. But that's a pretty amazing statistic. Yep, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's just, I guess I hadn't realized that, but that's pretty crazy that two drivers, have always been right there at the top for, almost 20 years. That's pretty crazy.
It sort of reminds me of something else that we've discussed before, which is, Abu Dhabi today, the last race of the season, we have Max Verstappen world champion, Lewis Hamilton world champion, Sebastian Vettel world champion, Fernando Alonso world champion. I believe Max will win again next year. I just think he's so good. Red Bull is so focused. We could be getting real quick to a situation where we've gone from 4 driver champions on the grid to just 1.
Yeah, I mean, it depends how how long Alonso and Hamilton choose to stay in the sport, and how, I guess, then what happens in the next few seasons in terms of who wins those championships. I think it's not unreasonable to expect Verstappen to keep winning, but I mean, we saw how good Mercedes came back this season. I think it also wouldn't be surprising to see Mercedes at the top again and see either Russell or Hamilton continue to win.
I do agree with that. I also think even though we knock Ferrari a lot, and deservedly so, the fact that Charles came in second this year, even though I think over the course of the season, the Red Bull was a better car. It didn't look like that at the first several races with the DNFs for Red Bull and the speed of Ferrari. But I think over the course of the season and the full development of the cars, Ferrari was just the second best car, and potentially even the third best, given how well Mercedes continued to improve. And given the number of strategic blunders by Ferrari, I think this is a testament to Charles Leclerc. I think Max dominating the sport this year is probably the biggest story in F1 this year. Russell, with more points than Hamilton, maybe is the sort of the second big story of the year. But Charles, with all the issues Ferrari put before him, needlessly so, coming in second, I think that is another positive story and really a testament to his abilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought he was one of the best drivers overall this season, and consistently put that car in the top 5. He got, I don't know, something like 11 podiums this year. Came in second in the race for that drivers' championship when, frankly, he had no business being there. Perez should have just absolutely dominated the race for second, as Bottas always did with Mercedes. I was surprised that he was even close. I think he had something like 60 plus points more than his teammate Carlos Sainz, who I also felt drove really well throughout the season. That's a really solid driver lineup at Ferrari, and definitely a positive for them. They just have to get the car and the team and the strategy behind them in order to take the next step and try to win at least one of those championships.
I do think they can. I really believe Ferrari, if they get their house in order, they have everything needed to compete with Red Bull and Mercedes, win both a driver championship and constructors championship in 23 and or 24. I also want to say, I think it's easy for us to knock Sergio Perez a bit because Max so thoroughly outraced him. But I think just surviving in that Red Bull environment is testament to his grit and his ability. When you look at between Christian Horner and Max Verstappen, they've chased out Ricciardo, Danny Kvyat, Albon, Carlos Sainz, had issues there. Sergio's been able to survive in that environment. He almost came in second this year. I think, he may not be the best driver on the grid, but I think he has shown some tenacity to go along with his driver talent.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's a lot of characteristics that make up a good driver. and he has a lot of them. He just is not one of the top, 3 drivers on the grid. And, when you have the best car on the grid, it's tough to not see you compete with your teammate. It's obviously, we believe that Verstappen is far and away the best driver on the grid, and it would be hard for anybody to stay with him. But that's what we always asked of Bottas, was to compete with Hamilton, right? I mean Rosberg did for 3 seasons and ended up winning a championship. But with Bottas, he never even came close. Perez, hasn't even come close. And it just makes it more fun when you have another driver there that can compete in the same car. I think Mercedes now has that with Russell and Hamilton. I think that'll be really exciting next season. Ferrari, Sainz, and Leclerc. I know Leclerc ended up, getting quite a few more points than Sainz this season, but there were times throughout the middle of the season where it looked like Sainz was the better driver. At no point have we seen in the last 2 seasons Perez look like he was better than Verstappen.
Yeah, I think next year, the reason I believe Max will win his third in a row next year is because I do think he's currently the best driver on the grid. Red Bull has a great car, but there's going to be so many heated battles in all the other teams. I think Max does not have to worry so much about what Sergio Perez will be doing. If you look at the teams next year, Ferrari, Carlos and Charles, they are not going to play nice with one another. They may speak nice about one another, but they are both going for the win. Russell, he got more points in his first year at Mercedes than Hamilton did. He is not going to play second fiddle. Next, let's go to Alpine. Alonso will no longer be with them, but Ocon and Gasly, the 2 Frenchmen, both believe they should be the number 1 in that team. That's going to create a lot of fireworks. Who else? How about McLaren? Lando Norris, who we just said is, we think, one of the better drivers in F1. They're bringing in a young gun. Is it Oscar Piastri? Oscar is going to have to prove himself, and he's going to want to go up and challenge Lando every race. I just think Max will run away with it, in part because of his talent, because of the Red Bull car, and because of his teammate, while so many of the other drivers are in fierce battles with their own teammate. I think that's going to be for a very exciting season.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the driver lineups are going to be really interesting next season. We're losing a lot of guys from this season that, I know lots of people really liked. But I think that we will see some really interesting inter-team battles. And, like you said, Verstappen, I don't think we'll have to deal with that. He's clearly the number 1 at Red Bull. He hasn't had to deal with it in the last 2 seasons, and I don't know why next season would be any different.
I am in agreement with you, so why don't we segue real quick to our top 5 for Abu Dhabi 2022. I know you always go first, but for me, I want to give a spoiler alert. In my top 5, I do not include Sebastian Vettel or Daniel Ricciardo or even Mick Schumacher. Okay, Patrick, let's hear your top 5 for Abu Dhabi.
Well, that's very interesting of you because I don't include any of them either.
I mean, I think on this, we love the sport, we love the drivers, but when it comes to analysis, we're sort of ruthlessly fact-based.
Yeah, I mean, I think all 3 of those guys, I think, had solid races. Mick had a bit of a mistake, and up until that point, I thought he drove really well. But ultimately, I think there were better drives this weekend. So for starters, Leclerc. He basically managed to take second away out of the clutches of Perez. And frankly, he shouldn't have been able to do that, and he did. So he is my top driver for today. Then Verstappen, I mean, it was a cakewalk for him, which, like, he's in the best car. There's really no pressure on him. He doesn't really have to do anything. But to just not even have to try in this race and still win it, it happens to be very impressive, at least to me. So he's my number 2. Then I have Lando, kind of in no man's land throughout most of the race, but he worked really well with that McLaren, got some really good points for them, and almost helped them to a 4th place finish in the Constructors' Championship, only a couple points back of Alpine there. Then I have Ocon, who I felt like Alonso, his teammate, was driving better until some weird issue again with the car forced a DNF from him. But Ocon, always solid. I really think that he is one of the better drivers on the grid, but he doesn't really, show a whole lot. He's just kind of there. You don't really see him too much. And then all of a sudden, big points for Alpine, which is, I believe that is really critical for a team like Alpine, who's kind of hunting in that mid-pack all the time. And it worked out well for them this season, getting that 4th place finish.
Yeah, Ocon, he seems as if he never gets rattled. He's always focused. He seems to get the most out of the car, and that is not a car that there's most to be gotten out of. So yeah, I do think he's one of the more underrated drivers on the grid.
Yep. And then finally, I have Seb Vettel's teammate, Lance Stroll.
Wow.
I mean, I don't think anybody really expected much from the Aston this week. And if they were to get anything, I think everybody expected it to be Vettel. And Stroll just sort of casually waltzed up into the top 8. And I think that's a pretty impressive drive for that Aston at the end of the season. Yeah,
I had both Ocon and Stroll just outside my top 5. So you have Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Esteban Ocon, and Lance Stroll. For me, Charles. He had a great drive. He took second in the Drivers' Championship. It was a great weekend. He outraced his teammate Carlos. And I mean, despite everything Ferrari threw in his way, he came in second. And for this race, and my number 2 spot is Max Verstappen. Again, he's got the championship locked up. If he decided not to even race, he wins. There's no issue, and yet he easily won. He had a fine start, not a great start, but a fine start. Kept his focus. Easy win. Third, Charles's teammate Carlos Sainz. I love those passes on Hamilton. I loved watching him in the first few laps. And again, as I've said before, nobody does better when there's no pressure than Ferrari. But it was a quality race. My number 4 is Russell. I put a lot of thought into this one, but he's done such a good job all season long. More points than his teammate Lewis Hamilton. Another fine job this week when it did not look as if Mercedes was going to do well at all. And even Hamilton had the DNF, although it had nothing to do with the temperature on the track. But I thought Russell did well, and then Lando. You have Lando as your third. I have him as my fifth. Just another solid race from him, week in, week out. He's what's got McLaren even battling for number fourth spot, pretty much all on his own. So Charles, Max, Carlos, George Russell, and Lando Norris in my top five. You mentioned Ocon. We did not really mention Alonso. He's still in there. Another DNF. I think, we've talked about what are the big stories at this race and this year. Max being so good, just dominating. Ferrari's troubles. George with more points than Lewis. Lando sort of, outracing almost everyone. The fact that Alonso finished only 11 behind his teammate. Now you might think, wait, that's Fernando Alonso finishing 11 behind his teammate. But my goodness, it just seemed like they gave him a Yugo to drive. There was that was there was no business of having Fernando Alonso in that car. It wasn't as bad as when he was in the McLaren a few years ago, but Renault, the Alpine, they have to do something. That's just been painful to watch much of this year.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like their power unit had so many issues. He had so many DNFs this season, and Ocon has to drive the same thing, but didn't seem like he was plagued by as many, reliability issues as Alonso has been this season. I think Alonso was fed up with it early in the season and decided to move on and go to Aston next season. And, I guess there can be some conspiracy theories there where, Alpine decided that they were going to ruin the end of Alonso's season. But that aside, I think he drove great this season. He's always a lot of fun to watch. Just really disappointing in quite a few races that he was forced to finish his race early.
What he's doing in his 40s, I think, is remarkable. He has lost almost nothing. I think he has sort of the sort of Ben Kenobi wisdom, sort of the world-weary wisdom about him. But put him in a car and he is going to get the most out of that car. And we're still seeing that. He's not lost a thing, I think. But it has been a bit painful to watch him in that Alpine.
Yeah. I thought it was funny because, when he had to come back in and he got that DNF in this race, the commentators were saying, that will basically mean he finishes behind Ocon, his teammate. I mean, that's just, I think, maybe the fourth time in his career where he's finished behind his teammate in the Drivers' Championship. And one of those was way back in 2001, which I think is pretty insane when you think about it. I was 4 years old. So just a remarkable career for him, and he's still going. And I'm excited to see him in that Aston next season.
I am too. Speaking of Alonso, we're looking at some of the veterans of the sport. Sebastian Vettel, his final race. We're saying goodbye to Sebastian. We're going to say goodbye to Daniel Ricciardo. We might be saying goodbye to Mick Schumacher. That's tough. It's always kind of a bit of a bittersweet moment at the end of the season. It's such a long season. The break, certainly for the teams, is so well deserved. It's a little bittersweet, but this year especially, Mick, though he's only been in for 2-3 years, he's really well liked. But Sebastian and Ricciardo have been in for over a decade, and they will definitely be missed.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be very just kind of weird not seeing them on the grid next season. they're sort of big personalities on the paddock, on the grid. You sort of always see them and what they're doing, and everybody really likes them. They love the sport, and I think have been really good sort of ambassadors for the sport. And so it'll be really, really tough to not see those guys there. And then for Mick as well, I think he's gotten so much better throughout this season, and I think having Magnussen as his teammate has actually helped him a lot. And I think it'll be tough for him to not be racing next season. It's possible that he gets picked up by another team at some point. I think he is good enough. But it's like you said earlier, it's kind of a ruthless sport, and you have to be bringing something to the table as a driver, whether that's money, sponsorships, whatever, or just raw talent. You have to be bringing something, especially to a team like Haas, which really struggles. They decided to go in a different direction, and that's tough to see. But if he can find a way back into the sport, I think it would be well deserved.
I agree. I hope all the best for Mick Schumacher. This race, we had Max, Charles, and Sergio on the podium. That was somewhat common this season. I think it'll happen again next season. But virtual podium. Who do you think belongs on the virtual podium this week, Patrick?
Well, I think, of course, you have to mention that the DankeSeb tributes. Of course, like we just mentioned, Seb, very well liked by everybody around the sport, a four-time world champion, and deciding to retire after this season. So kind of giving him a big send off was everybody. And I think that was nice to see. In addition to that, F1 came out this week and announced they were going to be backing a new series, the F1 Academy, which is an all women's series, sort of feeder series into the F3 and F2 series, and maybe getting up into F1. So I just think that's cool, because, they're trying to sort of get a larger base talent pool, I think. We've regularly discussed sort of the F2 bias in Formula One, and they don't really look outside of other series to other drivers. IndyCar is sort of the big one that we always talk about, but we don't ever see anyone from the W series or really any other series in the world come to F1. You kind of have to go through that F3, F2 progression. And I think to sort of broaden that base, it is important for the sport. And I think it's a good idea. Whether it will survive or not, I don't know. But the F1 Academy is on my virtual podium this week.
Nice. DankeSeb and F1 Academy. For me, I did not want to do this because I think it will be a bit controversial, and I don't want the virtual podium to be a bit controversial. And I don't want to have the same person or entity on there two in a row. But last week, I put Christian Horner on the virtual podium, and I'm going to do that again this week. I was watching the race, watching the pre-race activities, and I watched a short interview with Ross Brawn. And, Ross Brawn has had such a massive impact on the sport with Williams, with his own team, with creating these new rules and sort of really guiding F1 as a sport and really having a huge impact. And I realized, Christian Horner may have an even bigger impact. And he might have the biggest impact on Formula One of anyone currently associated with the sport. Red Bull has been fighting for championships now for over a decade. They built the Red Bull Academy. The Red Bull team is one of the most fun, focused teams in Formula One. They've really put together a great sort of driver training academy. They built the whole infrastructure for having a constructor. They're now working on building their own power units. He's always there to talk about F1. He's such a great ambassador to the sport. I think Christian Horner might be the most impactful person in Formula One currently, and that includes Lewis Hamilton, that includes Liberty Media, that includes Ross Brawn, and others. So I'm putting Christian Horner on my virtual podium.
Yeah, I think that is certainly an argument that can be made.
All right, switching to the soft compound. What did you think of Haas's announcement of putting Nico Hülkenberg in that seat next year? They booted Mick Schumacher and are bringing back Nico Hülkenberg.
I thought that it was weird. I think it, they have stuck with the same group of people for basically their entire time in F1. They've stuck with Gunther the whole time in F1. And I don't think Mick has done anything really wrong in that car. And to bring in Hülkenberg, which, I don't think Hülkenberg is a bad driver. I just don't think that he brings anything to the team that Mick doesn't. It seems weird to me that they would just choose to boot Mick and lose the Schumacher name for a driver that's just good.
I agree. I also think, and we touched on this before, that Gunther is just constantly shifting pieces about, and it sort of shields his results. This year, they finished in 8th. I think by getting rid of Mick Schumacher, bringing in Nico Hülkenberg, the absolute best they will do next year is 7th. So to me, that extra spot is not worth getting rid of Mick Schumacher, that potential extra spot. However, I'm going to try to make this positive and hope that it isn't just Gunther moving pieces about, sort of trying to deny the results of his leadership. And remember, when Haas got into F1 several years ago, they battled for close to the mid-pack. They have faltered. They've only gotten worse. But my hope is that this is a sort of a seriousness, a professionalization of the Haas team, of them saying, look, we're not going with younger drivers. We're not going with name drivers. We're going with what we think are the best drivers we can get and the best car we can get, and just sort of compete as a professional F1 team and not as some sort of odd drive to survive darling. I think I'm wrong. I think you're right, and it's sort of a meaningless move that harms a fine young driver, but that's sort of the best I can put on this. Speaking of the Schumacher name, Michael Schumacher, and Lewis Hamilton both have 7 championships. Sebastian Vettel, this is his potentially final race today, has 4, putting him 3rd all time. This is going to be controversial, Patrick. Do you think Sebastian Vettel is the 3rd best driver of all time in Formula One?
Oh, that's very interesting. I think that Seb Vettel has had a pretty incredible career. Obviously, 4 championships in a row with Red Bull, and for a couple of those, he had to battle pretty hard. I think he beat out Alonso on pretty much the last lap of the final race of the season for one of those, right? So, an incredible career. If I had to go with my gut, I would say I think there have been better drivers all time in F1. So I would put him just off of my top 3.
I would as well. I think he's a great driver. I do not believe he is the 3rd best driver of all time. I do miss that Seb Vettel, though. The Seb Vettel of championships, who was ruthless, who was much more of a dick than Max Verstappen will ever be. That was the Seb Vettel I liked. The Seb Vettel that now goes on about, picking up litter, that's not the Seb Vettel that I'm going to remember. Speaking of Seb Vettel, since this was his final race, possibly, Alonso differs, but Seb says it's his final race. All the other drivers took him out to dinner, and I thought it was interesting because there was a picture of all the drivers at the dinner, and you rarely see that. You rarely see all the drivers and just the drivers. I thought it was funny, though, because for one, I thought, well, Alonso's such a dick that I guarantee you he bought the most expensive drink there, But in the picture, you notice the Ferrari drivers aren't smiling. I think everybody else had a nice smile. So that made me laugh.
That is funny. Yeah, Ferrari is just so... They're like this prim and proper and like really uptight, organization that they always, force their drivers to say and do like only, I don't know, just very, very like uptight and proper. It's really interesting to see that. And then all of the drivers, they seem to like be allowed to have their own personality. And then, the Ferrari guys are like, nope, you have to be one way and that way only, and you can't do anything outside of it.
I know, it's like, man, you're a driver in Formula One and you're on Ferrari, and they don't seem happy. I always think there is something amiss there. Like I was talking earlier, I think no team seems like they have more fun than Red Bull. No team seems like they have less fun than Ferrari. And I'm like, I don't get that. You're Ferrari. This is Formula One. This is it. It does not get more fun, more cool, more better than this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Ferrari sort of destroyed the Seb Vettel that you were just talking about, and sort of broke him down. I think, they did the same thing to Raikkonen. They tried very hard with Alonso until he got fed up and just left. So, two great young drivers. I hope that Sainz and Leclerc can sort of retain some of their hopefulness and happiness and joy that they drive with, or have driven with throughout their careers.
Across the line, that is the segment where we predict who will come in the top 5 in the next race. If we get a driver correct, that's 1 point. If we get them in the exact spot, that's 3 points. But there is no next race. This was the final race of the season. Patrick, son, what were the final standings in Across the Line?
Well, came down to the last race of the season. We were very close. I only scored 2 points this week to bring my total to 81. Lucky for me, you only scored 3 points this week to bring your total to 79. So I won this season 81 to 79.
Wow, that was close. That's great after that long of a season to sort of finish that close. I think that's pretty impressive. There's no next race, so there's no Across the Line. How about, I'm going to catch you by surprise on this one. What do you think will be the top 5? Just who you think will finish top 5 next year?
Top 5 next year.
And remember, this will go down on your permanent record.
All right. Here is my quick top 5. Hamilton, Russell, Verstappen, Norris, Perez. That's 5, right? Yep.
Perez, Lewis Hamilton, George Russell, Max Verstappen, Lando Norris, Sergio Perez. That is nonsense. That absolutely will not happen. All right, let me give you my top 5. Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, George Russell, Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz.
Damn.
So I have a Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes lineup similar to 2022. Well, that may be our crazy prediction for this episode, but do you have any other crazy predictions for end of season shenanigans, for the start of 2023? Let's hear them.
I don't know. How about Logan Sargeant is going to be filling Latifi's seat at Williams next season in American on the Formula One grid. And I'm going to say that he outraces Albon and scores at least 20 points for Williams.
Wow, I think that would be very impressive. In part because I don't believe Williams is capable of 20 points. But if he can beat the experienced Albon, who's a solid driver, that would be quite a debut. I will stick with debut as sort of the theme of crazy predictions this episode. Oscar Piastri, he very publicly spurned Alfa Romeo and went with McLaren. He'll be Lando Norris's teammate next year. My crazy prediction is that Oscar Piastri, driving for McLaren, will get more points than Alfa Romeo in total. All right. I want to remind our listeners, send your questions or comments to hardcompoundpod@gmail.com. We may read them on the show. We definitely will read them. And I also wish to thank you for listening to everybody's most beloved Father and Son F1 podcast. And for 2022, we are Lights Out.
See ya. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Fun show, son. I'm having your grandparents over for Thanksgiving. I say that with no fear.